Good morning, everybody. Today I'm talking about 50 years of the Club of Rome. I'm co-president of the Club of Rome together with my friend Anders Wijkman from Sweden. 50 years ago, Aurelio Peccei from Italy and Alexander King from Scotland were essentially the founders of the Club of Rome, together with a group of other very influential people. They were concerned about the predicament of mankind, as they called it, and mandated a study to be done on the dynamics of growth, which was published in 1972 under the title of The Limits to Growth, which became a world bestseller. I believe some 30 million copies were sold in so many languages, essentially saying that if the dynamics of growth were continuing for a couple of decades, collapse would become unavoidable in the first half of the 21st century. This was a shock to the world economy, society, journalism. Everybody was talking about it. And people began to be scared because so far growth was the most natural thing to have. Now, it was written still more or less in the so-called empty world. Today, in 2018, we have more than twice as many people on Earth, and human consumption has grown fivefold, perhaps eightfold. Climate has become a major problem. Biodiversity collapses are intriguing us, plaguing us. And we seem to run into a philosophical crisis. We more or less recognize what goes wrong, but when we try to do the right therapy, we end up doing the wrong thing. Let me give you an example for that. The nations of the world got together in Paris doing a climate convention or agreement on the existing convention on climate. And then the message comes home into the capitals of the world, and politicians there would say, well, yes, we have to do something about climate, but this is going to be extraordinarily expensive, so we need a lot more growth in order to pay the bill. That, however, would make things worse, not better. Because so far, we have an almost strict correlation between economic turnover, which is the gross domestic product, and emissions of climate-damaging chemicals, carbon dioxide, methane, and the rest. So, we may be good doctors for diagnosis, but awful doctors in therapy, making the disease worse. And that is a good indication of a philosophical crisis of our civilization. Now, in a book that Anders Wijkman and I have been editing with the help of 38 other helpers, mostly from the Club of Rome, we are discussing, first, of course, the trends over the last 50 years or more of non-sustainable development. And then, in the second part, we address the philosophical crisis, starting with a wonderful encyclical letter by Pope Francis called Laudato Si, in which he says that the continuation of a philosophy and action rewarding greed, selfishness, relentless competition is a recipe for suicide. He says if an observer from a foreign star was looking at the Earth, understanding what's going on, he would say, this is suicide. Now, it can't go on like that. But what then? Well, we better look at the heroes of our today's thinking, including economics, and find out if what they said is correctly understood and quoted. And the answer is no. Let's give one example. Adam Smith, the famous Scotsman, who discovered that selfishness can be a wonderful ingredient for more well-being of us all. If all in their respective professions do the right things with a degree of selfishness, wanting to get further, then the overall production will rise, which is good for all. However, he could very naturally assume that the geographical reach of that market and the geographical reach of the law were identical, so that the selfishness, the market, was completely embedded in a perfectly reliable frame of law. And then it's fine. But today, we have a world market, chiefly financial market, and the law is national, essentially. In particular, the Anglo-Saxon countries keep sabotaging the coming into being of global law. The Americans say simply, this is not in the American interest, and therefore they block it. So, there's a major discrepancy between the reach of the market and the reach of the law. That leads to destruction. And then we have a Belgian friend in the Club of Rome, Bernard Littard, who is a banker, who calculated for us that out of $1,000 crisscrossing the virtual atmosphere in milliseconds, $20 are used for paying for goods and services somewhere worldwide, and $98 are pure speculation. That means money, almost at the speed of light, is crisscrossing the world, always in search of maximized returns on investment. And that, indeed, is wrong. It leads to massive destruction. And then, very similar, David Ricardo, some 40 years later after Adam Smith, said international trade is a good thing. If the Brits produce more textiles than they can ever wear, and the Portuguese produce more grapes than they can ever consume, but the two are trading, then both get richer, which is a wonderful insight in favor of international trade, a very good intellectual innovation at the time. But for David Ricardo, capital stayed where it was. It was not traveling over the borders. So he can't be quoted for what is happening today, where some 98% of the international mobility of capital is pure capital, which is precisely the opposite of what David Ricardo has been saying. And then let me, as a former professor of biology, tell you that also Charles Darwin is massively misquoted. For him, he was delighted and fascinated by the growth of diversity over the millennia, the evolution. And one part of his philosophy was competition and selection. But selection means reduction of diversity, not growth. So it was essential for him to understand why also the so-called weaker traits of organisms were surviving, to create and maintain the diversity. So Darwinism is completely misunderstood as a relentless wiping out of the weaker ones. No, we need mechanisms including border isolation of ecosystems and species protected by the borders against competition. Like the finches on the Galapagos Islands that developed features that on the South American continent were done by woodpeckers or by parrots or by any other birds. And then on the isolated Galapagos Islands, they were able to create new virtues, like a finch cracking a cactus thorn to extend its beak so that it could carve into the bark of a tree, getting larvae out or so. In the presence of a woodpecker, they would never have been able to develop that. Okay, those were three of the heroes of modern thinking, all massively misquoted in today's economics. And then we go further and say reductionism, utilitarianism, simplicity of the analytical philosophy, which is essentially an anatomy philosophy, is not good enough for comprehending complex systems, including growing systems, including looking into the future. We probably need something like a new enlightenment. The old enlightenment of the 17th, 18th century was perfectly, a liberation actually for the European thinking, perfectly adapted to the empty world. But in a full world, many things look very, very different. A new enlightenment for the full world is what we are looking after. And so I think that this book, Come On, is equally revolutionary as Limits to Growth has been. Actually, the title is a bit, has two different meanings. In everyday language, come on means don't try to cheat me, don't be a fool. But it also has, come on, go for new ideas. And the first two parts of the book mean the everyday language, come on. Don't tell me current trends are sustainable. Don't stick to completely outdated philosophies. And then the third part says, come on an exciting journey towards sustainability. But we are not quite as far as that now. We have to begin to understand in which direction that new enlightenment could go. And we have one very strong suggestion, namely, overcome dogmatism and go for balance. Let me give you an example. Short-termism is the natural thing to do for today's economics. Long-termism is what we need so that also our grandchildren have a chance. But it is wrong to say short-termism is right or long-termism is right. Both are right. It's important to have a good balance between the two. Or, very similar, speed and stability. Of course, it's good to have speed, and the competition for speedier is good. On the other hand, it must not mean to destroy stability. Today's hype with disruptive technologies can be extremely damaging for what people want and like and need. So, again, a balance between speed and stability. We have a dozen more examples. I'm not going into that. But then we say a new enlightenment is a good thing. We in the West should better look into the Eastern culture, the Asian cultures, also to an extent African cultures, learning about balance, and then develop that to some kind of a world philosophy which is more tolerant, more future conscientious, and more benign for the environment. But 7.5 billion people cannot wait to go through the troubles of a new enlightenment. They must begin to act now. So the third part of the book, of Come On, has a different meaning. Come on! We have exciting opportunities today, like regulating financial markets, which is absolutely necessary, good energy policies, actually in accordance with the German Energiewende, a change of philosophy from centralized to decentralized, good agriculture, circular economy, and better soil protection, and many other things, and a new sense of justice in a good balance with the incentive structure of the markets. So we hope that the Club of Rome, with the help of Come On, will become one of the leading institutions in the world for admonishing about the wrongdoings of the day and providing a perspective for a better world.